Hey, so good afternoon, everybody. Today it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this quarter's Zoom session. This is Peter Glynn. He's a certified executive and leadership coach who brings over 2 decades of high stakes leadership, strategic thinking, and operational excellence to his coaching practice. As a U.S. Naval Academy graduate with a degree in systems engineering, Peter began his career as a Naval Special Operations Officer. As an Explosive Ordnance Disposal leader, EOD, he commanded joint service teams through 2 combat deployments in Iraq, leading under pressure, managing risk, and training international military and law enforcement partners. Peter's leadership experience extends beyond the battlefield. Following his naval service, he completed his master's degree in security studies at Georgetown University. This led him to serve as a senior officer in the intelligence community until his retirement in May of 2025. He is also a trained facilitator who has led mission and vision sessions, brainstorming sessions, key assumption sessions, and other critical thinking sessions at all levels of the federal government. So thank you very much, Peter, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, first and foremost, Nick, thank you for having me. And I'm just so excited to be a part of this group and to be able to present today. So I put together a presentation and I'm just going to go ahead and get it started. So really today's presentation, as you can see on your screen, coaching for engagement. So how to navigate networking using a coaching mindset. So really it's kind of, taking a look back at my career, what I'm doing right now, coaching, but then also the experiences that I've had as an intelligence officer and seeing, how I might be able to share those experiences in a meaningful way for this community. So, um, first, just a little bit about me. So, as Nick mentioned, coming from a Navy background, so I was a Navy EOD officer. I separated in 2010 and I transitioned into the Intel community until retirement last May. So, right now, I'm an ICF certified coach at the ACC level. And so, what that means is I've had the training as well as the hours and completed the certification exam, and I'm able to coach a whole range of various professionals. So, professionals that are just starting their careers, transitioning mid-career, as well as looking at retirement and what's next for them. So, in addition to being a coach, why am I here? So, why here in a veteran community at UConn? The reason why I'm here at UConn is my wife. So she's joining us on the call right now as well, Annie Wildermuth. So Annie is a proud alumni of the class of 2007. And so being a veteran, as well as being now a part of the UConn family, I think it's really important to bring this up, this idea of the communities that we're a part of, both the ones that are really obvious, like the veteran community, and the ones that might not be as obvious in terms of, 10 years ago, I was never part of the UConn community. Obviously, I admired UConn from afar for all of their basketball prowess, as well as just a great, dog mascot. But now it's really a part of my life. And a part of that is leaning into that community. And ideally, as I kind of navigate this presentation, it's something just to keep in the back of your mind of what are those communities that you're a part of that you may be engaging with, or maybe you haven't engaged with them to the full extent possible, and how you might be able to engage with them, network with them, and network intentionally with them going forward. So last but not least, as mentioned, I'm really passionate about coaching. I love being able to engage with people at various levels in their career, and I'm excited to be working with you today. All right. So, like any good presentation, as we learned in the military, we have to have objectives. So, this presentation may seem a little bit odd. What is coaching and networking? How does that have to do with one another? And what is coaching from a former Intel officer? How might that be beneficial to what I'm going through in daily life? Perhaps how I'm building my business and how I'm growing and expanding professionally. So, here are the 5 objectives that I'm looking to cover with this presentation. So really what I'm going to do is start with an overview of some of the key coaching tenets that can be useful for all aspects of your life. How you might be able to engage with your family, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, or new associates that you meet over time. Then I plan on discussing some of the lessons learned from a career in intelligence and how it applies to intentional networking, not just having conversations just to have conversations, but really conversations that are meaningful, that expand your professional and potentially your business profile. And then finally, bringing the two together. What I've learned in my time coaching, especially coaching veterans, is networking is a topic that almost always comes up. And so what I'd like to do is share some of those, key key conversation points that I've had over time, and also share an exercise that I've done with a number of veterans that I found to be really helpful and share that with you. So the goals for today. So I'm not going to try to turn you into a coach or an intelligence officer. That takes years to do. But what I am going to try to do is help you build those skills, or at least start building those skills to foster connection, improve collaboration and solve problems, listen better, and then network more effectively and intentionally. So first, what is coaching? I think I get asked this almost every day. What is coaching and how does it differ from just having a conversation in and of itself? So really, coaching, we've put the ICF definition in front of you. So you're really partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. So what does that actually mean? It's creating an environment and creating a conversation where it's built upon curiosity, partnership, and balance, and really focusing what's important to the person in front of you. So what that looks like is, just about an hour ago, I was on a coaching conversation. I was having a coaching conversation with a client. And really what it was is me entering the conversation with a mid-career manager who was at a second level management position and asking her where she was in her career, what was top of mind to her and what was important to her about navigating the challenges that she was having on a day-to-day basis. It was also providing her the space, to just explore what it is like to, transition through ambiguity or to lead and have difficult conversations. And, giving her the space and that outlet to have that conversation was really meaningful for her. And also, at times I would offer, would it be helpful if I provided an observation or provided a suggestion? And she had choice in the matter. She could say, I really would appreciate how you would navigate a difficult conversation, or, well, I appreciate you offering the suggestion. It's just really more helpful for me to kind of talk through it and kind of think through my own thoughts. So that's just kind of an idea of what coaching is in and of itself. So first things first. So coaching is additive and it's not a replacement for certain forms of communication. So, we say this in terms of it doesn't replace the need to directly communicate. And what I mean by that is, especially when you think of professions such as, legal professions, medical professionals, potentially engineers, like there are things that you directly need to communicate, whether it's related to the law, whether it's related to a diagnosis, whether it's related to any kind of structural integrity of a building or things of that nature. So, there are times that coaching may not be as applicable as you think. So it's not a be all end all. But that being said, coaching is very additive in the sense of it can be a different way or an additional way of how you might be able to communicate. So an idea is, I'm calling in right now from Northern Virginia. So for those on the East Coast, going all the way up to, I think, Maine, we have I-95. And you think about I-95 in rush hour, it's gridlock. How nice would it be to have another lane of traffic? Coaching is kind of that extra lane. It might be able to give you that third or fourth lane to just give a different way of communicating, different way of transiting. And it's additive and it's not a replacement for those established norms or those established means of communicating. So why coaching skills matter, especially within this community, within the veteran community. So if you could think of, either earlier today or this whole week, when you consider your recent engagements, how many times were you given unsolicited advice or you were just talked to? I would imagine that it's happened more than once over the course of the week or perhaps over the course of 2 weeks. Coming from a military environment, we have a chain of command. We have ordered and we have orders that we have to follow. There's orders that we're given. So we're often either talking to or talked at. And so when I bring this up, coaching is not about telling what to do. It's about partnering to understand. And so what I like to do is kind of think of this, when you have a coaching engagement or really an engagement using coaching skills, is to use a sports analogy. And so speaking to UConn audience, I think it's appropriate to bring up basketball, great basketball teams on both the women's side and the men's side. And when you think about basketball, one of the big conditions or indicators of success is time of possession. So you think of if you control the ball for a greater amount of time than your opponent, it is a condition that will likely lead you to score more points and ultimately win. When you think of a conversation, though, I would offer that it's the opposite. And when you're thinking it from a coaching mindset, It's not time of possession. If you're speaking more than the person that you're speaking to, you win the conversations. In many ways, you lose. So when you think about coaching, it's about how you partner to understand how do you get that balance in time of possession, or the time that you're speaking, the time you're listening. And I would even go one step further. If you lose the time of possession, so to speak, if you're talking less than you're listening, that is a net win, because you're understanding the person that you're talking to more than you're projecting what you need to think, what you think is important to say. So the end result is more trust, more process, better results, satisfying engagements, and really enduring engagements. It offers you the opportunity to continue to have that conversation beyond that initial engagement. So it begs the question, what's it like to listen? So this is something that, through the coaching training, is one of the first tenets. It's these different levels of listening. And I bring this up because it's really important, because up until I got to, my initial coaching training, I never really heard about how to listen at different levels. And I think it's really important to bring it up. And if you've heard it before, perhaps to hear it again. So you can see on the screen the three different levels. The first level of listening is just really at a very, very surface and superficial level. You're internally listening, but really what you're doing is you're listening to already respond. As I'm talking, you're already coming up with your response to what I'm saying, and it's really focused on yourself. The level 2 is a little bit better. So it's focused listening. So you're hearing the topic itself. But again, you're kind of keeping it at a superficial level, and you're kind of bounding it to the subject in and of itself. Where it gets interesting and where it becomes really impactful is if you can reach up to that third level, that global listening. So you're really listening to the words and the content, but you're also listening to the tone. You're listening to the pace. You're listening to the emotion, the body language. And really, you're also listening to what isn't said and approaching it with curiosity. Like, wow, I would have expected something like this and it was missing. I wonder what's going on. And you're really listening to really encapture everything. So give a little bit of example of like what this actually looks like on all three levels. So, my wife and I had the opportunity last night to watch the UConn Villanova game. So if I were to encounter somebody and we're talking about, hey, did you see the game last night? Level 1 listening is, did you see the game last night? Immediately I'm going to, yeah, I saw the game. My wife was part of the UConn basketball team as a manager. Let me tell you all these things about all the times that we saw UConn when they came down to Georgetown, things of that nature. Very surface level. Level 2 would be, yeah, I saw the game last night. It was a great comeback in the second half. I can't believe, this team this year, they're undefeated. This is wonderful. This is great. Level 2, talking about the content, continuing with the conversation. And then level 3 is, bringing it up. And a level 3 conversation, if somebody was listening to me at level 3 for the game last night, they would understood that like, hey, this was actually a meaningful connection. It was a family event. This is how we've incorporated UConn women's basketball game into our family. The rivalry was great. But the thing is, it wasn't a rivalry for me internally 10 years ago. My dad went to Villanova. My wife went to UConn. This is really important, and it's meaningful now. That didn't have the significance or the meaning 10 years ago. And it had absolutely nothing to do about the fact that they won last night. And it's about really what this game and what this team means to our family, as well as how we're able to share it within our community. So that's kind of like a level 3 example. So how do you listen better? Here are some tips to actually, put it in practice. The first 2 tips, I say this, as a pro tip, being a coach, but also being a prior intelligence officer. Silence is a gift that you can offer, and you can do it and you can do it by pausing and counting to 5. And I say that because people have a desire to fill silence. And if if you want to put it into practice, try it out. Count to 5. See if somebody is going to feel uncomfortable enough to fill that silent pause. But in practice, what it really does is it offers an opportunity for the person that you're talking to fill that space in whatever way that they want to. And a lot of times what you do is you find out really meaningful details, things that maybe not would have come out in response to a comment or a question, but really maybe what's that deeper meaning behind the subject that you're talking about. Maybe it's a point that might not make, that logical sense to be a part of the conversation, but it allows you to have that follow-on question that might dig deeper and really have that meaningful connection. Other ways for listening better is the idea of paraphrasing back what you heard. So, you hear something, hey, I heard you just say this. Did I capture that right? Or, perhaps there was a couple ways to understand the meaning of what you heard, a way of kind of getting a little bit more of a clarification of, in what way did you mean this? You can also notice and ask about the shifts in energy and tone. And also notice if the client mentions something repeated. There's a phrase that we use of that horse will come around again. So when you hear the same theme come up over and over and over again in these engagements, there's definitely some importance that's being placed upon that person in terms of talking it. It's top of mind to them. It may not sound the same every single time that they bring it up, but it's of importance. And so it's worth, paying attention to and understanding what that means. So then it gets to great. We're listening great. We're listening at the level 3 level. We're really connecting with a person. How do we go about asking questions? What are the things that would, be powerful questions that would lead to these meaningful conversations and lead to the meaningful subjects that we hope to have? And so here are some, ideas and ways that you can ask powerful questions. So first is asking the open-ended question. How might you be able to ask a question, that would allow more than a yes, no, or a one-word answer? Give this space to the person that you're talking to instead of saying, did you see the game last night? Of what did you think about the game last night? Did you see the game last night? Yes, I did. No, I didn't. Conversation shut off. What did you think about the game last night? Well, I saw the game last night. It was great. And the second half was fantastic. Or no, I missed it. I wish I saw it. What did I miss? So in either case, whether it was yes, I saw it or no, I didn't, by rephrasing the question in a way that's open-ended, it allows for more engagement and more discussion. The second point is keeping it colleague-centric, but really keeping it centered on the person that you're talking to. What's important to you about this? You brought up this theme repeatedly. I sense that there's some importance to it. What's important to you about it? Keeping it short. I wish I could say that I'm good at this, but I'm guilty of doing this. Keeping the question short. If you have a 10-word question, how could you make it a 5-word question? And also, when you consider about it, a preamble of, here's all the reasons why I'm asking the questions, how might you be able to just drop that preamble and just ask the question? I can't say I'm perfect at this, and this is something that I have to remind myself about repeatedly, but it's something that's really important. Keep the question short. The next and the fourth, I think, in my opinion, is probably the most impactful and powerful tip that I've gotten and I pass along to you. In the past, I would always think of why as a very important question, a very deep question, a way of connection. But what I've learned through coaching, through training, as well as in practice is the use of why in a question oftentimes is associated with judgment. And by doing that, sometimes it can lead to separation and really kind of make conversations go, diminish rather quickly. So how are you able to, remove why? A great way of doing it is to basically replace it with what or how. So an example of this is if I were to ask the question, why did you join the military? For this veteran community, it might be a simple answer. Like I get to ask this question, I've gotten asked this question for the last 20 years, why I joined the military. But for some people, they might question like, hey, are you judging me that I made the wrong decision of joining the military? So a different way of phrasing it is, what factors led you to join the military, or how did you decide to join the military? It's a way of giving a little bit space, but also taking away any kind of judgment of, really understanding of, hey, what were the reasons that caused you or that gave you the desire to join the military? That's what I'm really curious about. I don't want to communicate any of my biases. I just want to know you a little bit better. So, whenever you can avoid whys and replace it with what or how, a great suggestion. And then last but not least is this idea of question stacking. And again, similar to keeping it short, I'm guilty of this too. One question at a time. What factors led you to join the military? Let somebody answer that. It wasn't what factors led you to join the military? What factors, led you to drive you to become, to go to the Navy? How did you end up in EOD? One at a time. This is why I joined the military. This is why I was called to, the Navy service. And this is why I went into the EOD community, being able to answer one at a time. So asking permission, this is something that's really key in coaching. And it's also really relevant as it relates to networking. So in coaching, it's a way of asking permission to share an observation or to provide a suggestion, but it's really important also in networking. So, as noted in the slide, it really, respects autonomy and agency, and it builds trust. So in a networking context, it's, would it be okay if I followed up in a week? Would it be okay if I shared a colleague's contact information, or may I broker an introduction? So you're giving choice to that person that you're talking to in a networking conversation. But the key is you got to respect the answer, what it is. That builds trust. So if you offer an idea, hold it lightly. An example I'd like to give is, ironically, my wife and I were at a UConn Georgetown game about a month ago, and I ran into a friend that I hadn't seen in about 20 years. So, we wanted to connect, we wanted to catch up. We obviously couldn't do it at the basketball game. So, the question that I asked was, would you be free to catch up over lunch or coffee in the coming weeks? Send him the text. The answer that I got was, sorry, I'm actually TDY for the next 2 weeks, but let's exchange contact information so we can look to meet up in mid-March. Fantastic. I go to that example because if I'd use a different way of, we gotta grab coffee, we haven't seen each other in 20 months, in 20 years, I'm not sure if I would have gotten that same response. But by using, that choice and giving him the space to recognize, hey, he's constrained by what his conditions are, but he still would like to meet at a more convenient time. Ultimately, we're looking to link up and have that conversation down the road. And it was ultimately a positive interaction. So as I wrapped up coaching, moving on to networking. So what I learned about networking, from a career as an intelligence officer, so throughout my career in intelligence, I had the opportunity to serve in multiple roles. I was a targeter, I was an analyst, I was a program manager, I was a supervisor. I had the opportunity to chase bad guys doing counterterrorism work. I understood various systems for technical development. So when I say technical development, think of Q and James Bond, kind of building those widgets, that you could hand off to James Bond, and also support case officers. So when I say case officers, I really mean James Bond, that front-facing individual that's going to be engaging with those foreign agents, going to be able to kind of put it out there a little bit in terms of having those conversations. And really, what I've learned is some of the same mindsets that you might tackle an intelligence problem is similar how you intentionally network. So when I think of networking, I think of it in two perspectives. I think of the perspective of yourself in your own network and how you might be able to expand it. And then I also think about the system that you want to networking in. So first, how might you be able to position yourself to expand your own network? And then second, how do you understand the ecosystem that you're trying to network in to do so with intention to create the greatest impact? So that being said, I'm going to give examples and talk to it, but it's really power in both having in-person and virtual engagements and kind of looking at it from a blended strategy perspective. So first off, to start with yourself, what are your goals for networking? So it's a basic question that often gets overlooked, and it's extremely important for any intelligence operation of like, what are you actually trying to accomplish? Or in this case, what goals are you trying to accomplish with networking? And there really isn't any wrong answer. It could be about creating a new job opportunity, creating new access to various businesses or people. Maybe you just want to increase your business. Perhaps you want to hire a new employee or grow your team. Or frankly, maybe you just want to learn something or increase your social connections. So this is really important. There's 3 questions up here on the screen. This is where you can call your shot of what does success look like? We use this in coaching a lot of, if you were successful, what would it look like if you blank? In this case is in networking. If you were successful in networking, what would the future look like for you? So I posed the 3 questions in front of you. What does it look like? What does successful networking look like to you? And then how might you be able to structure ways to encourage these interactions? And what are your priorities and how might they change? And so walking through them, I think it's important to go one by one. So the first one that I post to you is, if you were looking to the future, what does successful networking look for? What are you going after? And what is the long game? So I say this a bit tongue in cheek, but if you equate if you think about networking and your ultimate goal is a job, you think about it in engagements. So if you go into an initial networking conversation, should there be a reasonable expectation that you're going to get a job offer in this first one? I would say most likely not. So I say it tongue in cheek, but if you equate networking to dating, if your end goal is to find like a long-term partner, is it realistic to assume that you might achieve that in initial encounter? Similarly, probably not. But what is possible is to meet somebody and encourage them to have a second encounter and a second engagement and continue that conversation going forward. So like when you think of your end goal of successful networking, also recognize what might be those initial goals. Would an initial goal be a second conversation? Perhaps maybe it be one or two additional contacts that you didn't have before that this person may be able to provide you. So the second is how you might be able to structure ways to encourage these interactions. This can take many different avenues, but it really comes down to this, like how are you being intentional and really what it means to, like, what are you bringing attention to as you're engaging with this networking conversation? And I think about the conversations that I've had with case officers over time, and this is where it becomes really important. They are incredibly intentional in terms of how they engage with people and what they do in terms of encouraging the best outcome, but also understanding the dynamics that go in play. Are you looking to have a conversation in person? So is the area conducive to having that conversation? Can I have it individually, or am I able to have that conversation in front of a couple of people? Is my anticipated engagement just a couple minutes with a follow-up, or am I looking for a more in-depth conversation? So if it's a more in-depth conversation, how might I be able to set those conditions up front that would encourage that? And so when I say that, an example might be, perhaps you reach out virtually or via text. And I'd love to be able to talk about job opportunities. Here are some of the questions that I'd like to ask you. Do you have 15 or 20 minutes? As opposed to, hey, I just noticed you at a conference and, could we talk about something, briefly, 1 or 2 minutes? So that being said, it's how do you shape the environment that really kind of encourages you to have the greatest amount of success? And then the third is, what are your priorities and how might these change? And really this harkens to a story again that I've had with a case officer. And really it was earlier in my career and we were trying to get this case officer to be able to work with a foreign agent. And we thought that this agent had access to a member of had access to a senior government official. So within the first couple minutes of this conversation, this case officer realized, hey, this guy is so far away from who we're actually trying to get a hold of. He doesn't have the value that we think we have. And so he comes back after about a 2-hour meeting and he was like, hey, Peter, unfortunately, like we thought it was one thing. It wasn't the thing that we thought. And I was like, well, I got to ask you, I'm kind of curious. You found out in the first couple of minutes that this wasn't worth your time, but you still stayed for about an hour or two and you really had the length of the conversation. Like, I'm trying to understand what's important. And basically what he did is he described something to me that really kind of I've held on to a lot. He used the time. He was like, there was actually a lot of value in the conversation I had. While it wasn't the connection that I thought it was, and it wasn't the person that I'd be having this enduring relationship with, what it did provide me is it really lowered the stakes, and I was able to have a conversation to better understand how best to engage with this government. So I could ask, what were those relationships like that, aren't really kind of covered in the media or may not be on the surface? Where is the tension, in the organizational structure? What does the organizational structure looks like on paper? And what does it actually look like? Where are those centers of power that may not be obvious to those from the outside? And also, he had the opportunity to talk for the better part of about an hour or two with somebody in their own language. So he was able to pick up what are those key terms that they use, how he could be able to use that and become smarter for those subsequent conversations. And really, so his priority changed from trying to gain access to becoming a student and really learning about it. So what are your priorities and how they may change over the course of a networking conversation? So next, I'd like to show you this chart. And I use it in two ways. I think it's really important. One is to understand you and your own network, but then it's also a way of looking at an ecosystem. So really, first, if you look at you and your own network, you have 3 layers, and it really doesn't have to be limited to 3, but just using 3 for simplicity. The first layer is that closest layer of connections that you have to you that are the center of you. These are probably the most limited, but these are the ones that know you best. They're your family, your best friends. These are the ones that you could call any day, anytime, day or night. They'll pick up the phone, they'll answer, and likewise, you do that the same for them. That level two is kind of a little bit further out, not as exclusive as level one, but perhaps these are people that you work with and you see on a routine basis. Perhaps they're neighbors. Perhaps there's people that you went to school with, but maybe you keep in touch with, maybe not on a regular basis, but on a pretty good basis. So you have a lot of shared memories. In the veteran community, maybe these are people that you served with, in this level two. Level three is even more further out. These might be those distant work associates, the friends of friends, the people that you met at conferences. Perhaps you met them at a happy hour or a wedding. These are the, the people that you didn't necessarily serve with intimately, but, they served with others in different commands that you kind of know who they are, but you don't really know who they are. So the reason why I bring this up to you is the idea of how do you expand your network and where these opportunities might be. And so really it comes down to research that has shown the idea of weak ties. And what I mean by weak ties are those level three, kind of on the fringes of level three, that you don't really know very closely, not like your level two or your level one, but those weak ties, historically, those are going to give you the greatest amount of opportunities for jobs, for access, for things that don't exist in your life right now. And so the challenge becomes, how are you able to expand your level three out so you create more and more and more weak ties to create more and more opportunities? So that being said, we can flip it on its head and look at this from an organizational or an ecosystem. I look at this, especially when it was counterterrorism work. You have your level one is your decision makers, your centers of power. So these are going to be like your C-suites, your heads of government, your thought leaders. Your level two are going to be those that work, as part of an organization, perhaps part of a government that, they're a little bit removed from the decision making. Then your level three, again, this is where things get really interesting. This is kind of the broader parts of the ecosystem that we don't necessarily always think about or always see. So these are the, from an organization standpoint, these are the contractors, the subcontractors. These are the former employees. Perhaps these are either the academic institutions that are pipelines into the company. Perhaps these are the companies that they constantly work with. These are the things that are, kind of on the fringes, outside of kind of the scope of where you might think of, a logical connection. So I bring this up in two factors. I think about it from an intel perspective. When we were working hard target countries, think of your Irans, your Chinas, your North Koreas, your Russias. It's really hard to place somebody at that level one to get to that center of government, a really important, really important person to be able to kind of develop the intelligence operation that you want. Similarly, in these hard countries, level two isn't an easy win. So what happens? It's really looking at that level three of, where might I be able to look at, perhaps there's companies, perhaps there's entities outside of the country. Maybe there's conferences that host certain individuals that would be worthwhile to create an encounter, looking at academic or other collegial networks, and being able to start on the outside and really kind of build your way inside, into that level one. So to take it outside of the Intel world and to kind of make it a little bit more practical, I'm calling you today from Arlington, Virginia. So Arlington is the home of Amazon HQ2. So within the power of proximity, just within the neighborhood, schools, spouses, friends, it's not terribly hard to find those level two connections in this area. So what happens if you're not in Arlington or you're not in Seattle for that matter of HQ1, and you want to work at Amazon, or you want to create a strong relationship with Amazon? This is where you can be a little bit creative and kind of go to what I was talking about in terms of how do you create and cultivate those weak links, but then how can you look at the Amazon ecosystem to support it? So, perhaps we're looking in New England. What are those schools? What are those companies? What are those contractors, subcontractors? What are those parts of Amazon that may be operating in New England that can, cultivate that level three and, start going with those weak ties, and then how would you be able to use that to create those ties to get into that level two, to get into level one? And I bring that up because Earlier, I had mentioned the blended strategy of being able to have in-person as well as virtual network. This is where the power of LinkedIn can really support you and really help you understand, who might be in proximate area of you. Perhaps there's somebody that worked in a company that you worked with before, a school that you went to, some kind of association to create that initial conversation to get you started. But just an idea, an exemplar from a company standpoint. So here we go with networking and coaching. So how does networking really appear in coaching, and particularly in the veteran community? So I mentioned it earlier that, every conversation that I've had in a coaching context, almost with a veteran, networking has come up. So networking with veterans either feels exceptionally comfortable when you're networking with other veterans, or exceptionally uncomfortable when you're working with non-service members and non-veterans, or a new area that may not understand you. The idea of working with veterans, you have that shared identity and that purpose, the understanding of terminology, the understanding of various units, different branches of services rank. It's really kind of that galvanizing principle that brings us all together. So where it gets uncomfortable is broadening your network outside of that service or veteran community. So think about the previous slide of that level 3. This is where it kind of gets really squishy and gets really, not necessarily comfortable. So the common phrase that I've heard among veteran clients is this idea about describing networking as transactional. I hate it. It feels transactional. It feels like it's very cheap. It's disingenuous. So it's really uncomfortable engagements where veterans are used to have meaningful, enduring conversations, relationships. It's built on this mutual trust of service. It's also built on, shared lexicon. There's a lot of use of acronyms that everybody can understand without explaining. So how do we get beyond this level of uncomfort and move into a more comfortable situation? And so this is, over the next couple of slides, describing a process that I've used, and it's been really helpful, for a number of veterans, and I'd like to share it with you. So first is, introducing this idea of polarities. At times in coaching, we use polarities with clients to help them observe their current state in the hope of shifting their perspective. So really what it means is this idea of looking at a situation with only two obvious pathways. So you can see the bar magnet that we all had in elementary school with a north and a south pole. Or thinking about, what's a binary situation, a black or a white, a cat or a dog, a north or a south, a right or a left. And so the goal is, how might you be able to create a third pathway in this seemingly, binary situation, or seemingly situation where there's only two solutions? And so I've come up with this polarities exercise that I really, I originally learned it through coaching training, but I've been able to apply it for, probably about 24 different veteran conversations. So if transactional is on one end, authentic is on the other. And the reason why I bring authentic up is when I ask a veteran, when you think of networking as transactional, what would you rather have it? And, oftentimes it's, I'd rather have that authentic connection, something of a meaningful conversation, a meaningful relationship, something that endures, something that I've had over time, something that I've really found very commonplace in service. And so it's like, great, this is a perfect starting point in terms of doing a quick exercise. So I got the chance to do this exercise about 24 times and keeping networking in the middle. And so how this exercise goes is really, what are the 3 best things about an authentic relationship? And so I've heard a lot of different, answers, but the key 3 themes that have come up is, the best qualities of authentic connection or authentic network, an authentic engagement is it's real connection. You have genuine trust, and it's an enduring relationship. It's, that's why, everybody wants authentic connection. Great. So let's talk about transactional. What gives you the ick about transactional engagements? So what are the 3 worst things or the worst qualities about a transactional interaction? And really what I've come, similar themes, the 3 that have come out are: 1, it's superficial, it feels dishonest, and it feels like it's a waste of time and it doesn't lead to anything. Okay, great. We've given space to the best of authentic and the worst of transactional. This is where it gets interesting. What are the 3 worst things about an authentic engagement? Typically, when I ask this question, I'm kind of given a puzzled look, some jokes, and, there's nothing wrong with an authentic relationship. It's all great. And it's like, okay, great. But if we're being honest with ourselves, what are the three downsides of an authentic engagement? It may take a couple minutes, but I get answers. And the answers that I typically get are these kind of, bounded in these three themes. First is it's resource intensive. It takes an intense amount of time, energy, and emotion. If you think about your closest connections, those level one connections, and you're having those conversations, either you're having them over the course of hours or you're having them at a frequency that are so high, you're also putting a lot of thought, energy, and emotion to how you're interacting with those people. And because of that, you have limitations on the number of new and continuing engagements. You can't keep having all of these close relationships. There's just not enough time to be able to have all of those meaningful connections. And then the last is kind of interesting. It's the tension when there's mismatch in values. And what I bring that up is, especially now in society, we have so many polarizing topics that when your view and their view don't match, it's creating tension at best and potentially conflict at worst. And so instead of having this idea that I have to blindly adhere to whatever the values are in that authentic connection, sometimes it creates that tension or the conflict. And it is a downside of that authentic engagements going forward. And so with that, now we've given space to the three worst parts of an authentic engagement. What are the three best parts of a transactional engagement? And so similarly, I kind of get that weird, look, maybe a veteran's kind of taken aback of, what are the best things about a transactional relationship? Are you kidding? But at this point, maybe it's not as long, maybe it's not as jarring, but the three best qualities that usually come up is it's less resource intensive. And because it's less resource intensive, it creates greater risk taking. So it allows you, to have those conversations or to have those introductions that maybe you wouldn't have done if you overthought it or you're trying to have this authentic connection. And you can engage with that person that perhaps you wouldn't if you thought that it was going to be this very deep, enduring, trusting relationship from the get-go. It allows you to have a greater number and a higher number of repetitions. So then what do we do with this? Now we have a list on the left and a list on the right. How do we make this third path? And really, this is where it becomes the authentic choice of the individual. What are the qualities, the best qualities from transactional and the best qualities from authentic that you can incorporate and create your own third way of networking? And what I found is typically it resolves around resources, being able to have more shots on goal or a greater number of engagements, which leads to greater risk taking. And then over time, it engenders having that greater trust and that greater relationship. So it's being able to kind of merge the best of both sides to create a networking experience that's more authentic to that individual. So now that we have, we've talked about, how to intentionally network, how to focus our efforts on certain areas, how we can kind of maybe get over some of our personal mental hurdles about networking. How do you actually do it in practice? Or what are some tips that might be able to be helpful from a coaching perspective and then also from an intel perspective? So we've already talked about it earlier about understanding your goals and priorities. Going into this engagement, have a clear understanding of, hey, what are you trying to gain out of this experience? And should the circumstances change, how would those priorities adjust and what could you still glean out of that experience or that engagement? The second is really important. It goes back to that term of that time of possession. How do you create balance in your engagement? How are you able to create a balance in a conversation? So we talked about some of the coaching tenets and ways of active listening, asking powerful questions, asking permission. Those are ways of creating balance. But then it's also, what might you be able to offer them? You have a network of yourself. You also have experiences, professional experiences, personal experiences. So understanding what are those things that you might be able to offer instead of just being asked, asking them of something. But then also being very clear with what is your ask. You're going into this situation, as we talked about, being clear and direct. And the responsibility is, I'm engaging with this because I notice that we have a shared background, but also understanding, my hope is to continue this conversation, more in depth at a later time. My hope is, might you be able to put me in touch with one or two colleagues, at your company? I'm interested in a job prospect, things of that nature. And then lastly is, how do you keep the conversation going? And what I mean by that is not how you take a 5-minute conversation and make it a 2-hour conversation, which everybody dreads, but it's more, as you're coming to a natural close to your conversation, how are you able to create an opportunity for you to re-engage further? So it could be something as simple of, asking permission. Would it be okay if I reached out with, followed up with you in a week? Might I be able to introduce you to a colleague? Perhaps it's giving a business card of, hey, here's a way of getting in touch with me. In the digital age, being able to tap phones to be able to share contact information. So you have a way of organically contacting them again. But really, it's taking that initial engagement and then carrying it forward and being able to keep that conversation going. So as we're coming to an end of this presentation, and I'd welcome any questions, here are just 6 key takeaways that I put together. So the top 3 are related to more of the coaching topics. So really is global listening is powerful and revealing. How might you be able to incorporate that level 3 listening more in your day-to-day interactions, but also in the interactions that you have with perhaps new associates and networking? Powerful questions drive insights. How might you be able to ask the what and how questions, avoiding the why, keeping it open-ended, try not to have single word answers, some of those elements that we talked about earlier. The third one, of course, is asking the questions to avoid why and asking what or how. And then moving on to networking, how, what we just talked about, how might you be able to create balancing conversations? How might you be able to look on the scoreboard or look at the stat sheet after that conversation, see that time of possession or that listening versus talking is either going to be equal or in favor of the person that you're talking to. And then also is, what is the network you hope to create? Being intentional with where you are now and where you want to be, and being honest with it in terms of how you might be able to own your own path to having an authentic networking experience. So with that, I leave you with contact information. I would welcome any follow-up questions, upfront after we finish this conversation by email or LinkedIn. Here's my name and email address at First Road Leadership. And with that, I don't know if anybody in the audience had any questions for me, but thank you for staying, and it's been a pleasure to present this to you.
No questions out there? Well, if you have follow-on questions, please reach out to either Peter or ourselves, and we can definitely make sure that you guys get linked up. Peter, thank you very much for a terrific presentation. Thank you very much for working with us at the EBV program. Thank you very much for working with the veterans on here that showed up today. And for all the veterans that signed on, thanks for being here again. We look forward to seeing you on the next quarter, which we'll have information on here soon enough. Again, thank you very much, Peter. Great presentation and a lot of great information for everybody.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure being with you.